Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our fun romp through Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, where I'm reading you the book and also we're chatting about it. I'm also getting lots and lots of Voxer messages and emails about it, and I got an email yesterday that made my day. The sender of that email, I'm sure you are watching. I cannot thank you enough. It made my day. So we are at Pemberley. We are the last place in the world that we expected our heroine to ever be. Elizabeth Bennet has traveled with her aunt and uncle to the Peak region, to Bakewell, to the countryside, the English countryside, which happens to be right in the neighborhood of Pemberley House, the home of Mr. Darcy, with whom she's had such a raucous relationship. Only it turns out that when they inevitably meet, he's as sweet as could be. There doesn't appear to be any ill will on his part at all, and she certainly doesn't feel it. So that's the interesting, intriguing, good part, is that Elizabeth Bennet has met Mr. Darcy out in the countryside, and they realize that there are no burnt bridges between them. But there's a bad side, because meeting Mr. Darcy and also meeting Mr. Bingley also means meeting everybody else. Everybody else connected with the Pemberley circle. And some of those people, now we know for sure, are not all that good. They're pretty rotten characters. And we're going to meet them now, because we are in chapter 45, and we're going to meet some of those characters now. It's the whole point of this chapter. Convinced as Elizabeth now was that Miss Bingley's dislike of her had originated in jealousy, she could not help feeling how very unwelcome her appearance at Pemberley must be to her, and was curious to know with how much civility on that lady's side the acquaintance would now be renewed. On reaching the house, they were shown through the hall into the saloon, whose northern aspect rendered it delightful for the summer. Its windows, opening to the ground, admitted a most refreshing view of the high woody hills behind the house, and of the beautiful oaks and Spanish chestnuts, which were scattered over the intermediate lawn. Imagine how cool that room must be at the height of summer. In a time with no fans, no air conditioners, imagine how nice that must be when it during that 1 week in back then, that 1 week in English summer that is unbearable. In this room, they were received by Miss Darcy, who was sitting there with Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and the lady with whom she lived in London. Georgiana's reception of them was very civil, but attended with all that embarrassment which, though proceeding from shyness and fear of doing wrong, would easily give to those who felt themselves inferior the belief of her being proud and reserved. I think that's supposed to be a little jab at us, as readers. Certainly a jab at the general folk of Meryton, because it's obvious now in retrospect that Darcy himself was feeling a little shy, thrust into the countryside and meeting all these new people, and that made him a little bit stiff and awkward. Mrs. Gardiner and her niece, however, did her justice and pitied her. By Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, they were noticed only by a curtsy, and on their being seated, a pause, awkward as such pauses must always be, succeeded for a few moments. It was first broken by Mrs. Annesley, a genteel, agreeable-looking woman whose endeavor to introduce some kind of discourse proved her to be more truly well-bred than either of the others. And between her and Mrs. Gardiner, with occasional help from Elizabeth, the conversation was carried on. Miss Darcy looked as if she wished for courage enough to join in it, and sometimes did venture a short sentence, when there was at least the least danger of her being heard. Miss Darcy is an introvert. Elizabeth soon saw that she was herself closely watched by Miss Bingley, and that she could not speak a word, especially to Miss Darcy, without calling her attention. This observation would not have prevented her from trying to talk to the latter, had they not been seated at an inconvenient distance. But she was not sorry to be spared the necessity of saying much. Her own thoughts were employing her. She expected every moment that some of the gentlemen would enter the room. She feared, that the master of the house might be amongst them, and whether she wished or feared it most, she could scarcely determine. After sitting in this manner a quarter of an hour, without hearing Miss Bingley's voice, Elizabeth was roused by receiving from her a cold inquiry after the health of her family. She answered with the equal indifference and brevity, and the other said no more. So there's friction here. Not all is happiness. Darcy and Bingley, Mr. Bingley, were overjoyed to see Elizabeth and catch up with her, but not all is happiness, especially in Pemberley House. The next variation which their visit afforded was produced by the entrance of servants with cold meat, cake, and a variety of all the finest fruits in season. But this did not take place till after many a significant look and smile from Mrs. Annesley to Miss Darcy had been given to remind her of her post. There was now employment for the whole party, for though they could not at all talk, they could all eat, and the beautiful pyramids of grapes, nectarines, and peaches soon collected them round the table. While thus engaged, Elizabeth had a fair opportunity of deciding whether she most feared or wished for the appearance of Mr. Darcy, by the feelings which prevailed on his entering the room, and then, though but a moment before she had believed her wishes predominated, she began to regret that he came. He had been some time with Mr. Gardiner, who, with 2 or 3 other gentlemen from the house, was engaged by the river, and had left him only on learning that the ladies of the family intended to visit Georgiana that morning. No sooner did he appear than Elizabeth wisely resolved to be perfectly easy and unembarrassed, a resolution the more necessary to be made, but perhaps not the more easily kept, because she saw that the suspicions of the whole party were awakened against them, and that there was scarcely an eye which did not watch his behavior when he first came into the room. It's not just the Gardiners, in other words. Everybody knows there's got to be something going on here. There's got to be something going on here, and the only something it could be is between Darcy and this Elizabeth girl, this Bennet girl from the country. In no countenance was attentive curiosity so strongly marked as in Miss Bingley's, in spite of the smiles which overspread her face whenever she spoke to one of its objects, for jealousy had not yet made her desperate, and her attentions to Mr. Darcy were by no means over. Miss Darcy, on her brother's entrance, exerted herself much more to talk, and Elizabeth saw that he was anxious for his sister and herself to get acquainted, and forwarded, as much as possible, every attempt at conversation on either side. Miss Bingley saw all this likewise, and in the imprudence of anger, took the first opportunity of saying, with sneering civility, "Pray, Eliza, is not the militia removed from Meryton? They must be a great loss to your family." There's a word for you, Miss Bingley. In Darcy's presence, she dared not mention Wickham's name. Of course, Wickham is who she's talking about. Not just Kitty and Lydia fawning over officers, but fawning over Wickham himself, and the special attention Wickham paid to Elizabeth. It's meant to be a bullseye, and the imprudence of anger is right, because Miss Bingley doesn't realize that the people who are going to be most affected by that comment are Bingley and his sister, or no, Darcy and his sister. In Darcy's presence, she dared not mention Wickham's name, but Elizabeth instantly comprehended that he was uppermost in her thoughts, and the various recollections connected with him gave her a moment's distress, but, exerting herself vigorously to repel the ill-natured attack, she presently answered the question in a tolerably disengaged tone. While she spoke, an involuntary glance showed her Darcy with a heightened complexion earnestly looking at her, and his sister overcome with confusion and unable to lift her eyes. Had Miss Bingley known what pain she was then giving her beloved friend, she undoubtedly would have refrained from the hint, but she had merely intended to discompose Elizabeth by bringing forward the idea of a man to whom she believed her partial, to make her betray a sensibility which might injure her in Darcy's opinion, and perhaps to remind the latter of all the follies and absurdities by which some part of her family were connected with that corps. Not a syllable had ever reached her of Miss Darcy's meditated elopement. To no creature had it been revealed where secrecy was possible, except to Elizabeth. And from all Bingley's connections, her brother was particularly anxious to conceal it, from that very wish which Elizabeth had long ago attributed to him of their becoming hereafter her own. He had certainly formed such a plan, and without meaning that it should affect her endeavour to separate him from Miss Bennet, it is probable that it might add something to his lively concern for the welfare of his friend. Here the narrator, I think, is being a little, just gently sarcastic. I think by now the reader is supposed to have the impression that Miss Bingley doesn't love her friend, and wouldn't care about hurting her if it would score a point against a seeming rival. Elizabeth's collected behaviour, however, soon quieted his emotion, and as Miss Bingley, vexed and disappointed, dared not approach nearer to Wickham, Georgiana also recovered in time, though not enough to be able to speak any more. What do introverts call recovery if you're not able to talk? Her brother, whose eye she feared to meet, scarcely recollected her interest in the affair, and the very circumstance which had been designed to turn his thoughts from Elizabeth seemed to have fixed them on her more and more cheerfully. She behaves perfectly. She's as embarrassed as he is, and she behaves perfectly. Needless to say, her family might not. other people in her family might not have behaved with such complete self-control. Their visit did not continue long after the question and answer above mentioned, and while Mr. Darcy was attending them to the carriage, Miss Bingley was venting her feelings and criticism on Elizabeth's person, behavior, and dress. But Georgiana would not join her. Her brother's recommendation was enough to ensure her favor. His judgment could not err, and he had spoken in such terms of Elizabeth as to leave Georgiana without the power of finding her otherwise than lovely and amiable. Yes, but Georgiana, did you find her lovely and amiable? I'd like it if we were told that, as opposed to just blind loyalty to your brother. Did you yourself, in fact, find her lovely and agreeable? When Darcy returned to the saloon, Miss Bingley could not help repeating to him some part of what she'd been saying to his sister. "How very ill Eliza Bennet looks this morning, Mr. Darcy," she cried. "I never in my life saw anyone so much altered as she is since the winter. She's grown so brown and coarse." Louisa and I were agreeing that we should not have known her again. However little Mr. Darcy might have liked such an address, he contented himself with coolly replying that he perceived no other alteration than her being rather tanned, no miraculous consequence of travelling in summer. "For my own part," she rejoined, "I must confess that I never could see any beauty in her. Her face is too thin, her complexion has no brilliancy, and her features are not at all handsome. Her nose wants character, there is nothing marked in its lines. Her teeth are tolerable, but not out of the common way, and as for her eyes, which have sometimes been called so fine," Darcy called them that, "I could never perceive anything extraordinary in them. They have a sharp, shrewish look, which I do not like at all, and in all her air altogether there is a self-sufficiency without fashion, which is intolerable." She could not be saying anything, much less timing the saying of that thing, more designed to make Darcy not only dislike her, but actively hate her. Talk about not reading the room. And she won't let it go. Persuaded as Miss Bingley was that Darcy admired Elizabeth, this was not the best method of recommending herself. But angry people are not always wise, and in seeing him at last look somewhat nettled, she had all the success she expected. He was thinking resolutely, however, and from a determination of making him speak, she continued. "I remember, when we first knew her in Hertfordshire, how amazed we all were to find that she was reputed beauty. I particularly recollect you saying one night, after we had been dining at Netherfield, 'She, a beauty! I should as soon call her mother a wit.' But afterwards she seemed to improve on you, and I believe you thought her rather pretty at one time." Darcy's had enough. "Yes," replied Darcy, who could no longer contain himself. "That was when I only first knew her. For it is many months now since I have considered her one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance." And then, if we're visualizing the scene, we could picture very satisfactorily, he turns on a heel and walks out. He then went away, and Miss Bingley was left to all the satisfaction of having forced him to say what gave no one any pain but herself. Good. We don't like her. Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth talked of all that had occurred during their visit as they returned, except what had particularly interested them both. The looks and behavior of everybody they had seen were discussed, except the person who had most engaged their attention. They talked of his sister, his friends, his house, his fruit, of everything but himself. Yet Elizabeth was longing to know what Mrs. Gardiner thought of him, and Mrs. Gardiner would have been highly gratified by her niece's beginning the subject. All the carriage ride home, the only thing either one of them is thinking about is Darcy, but neither one of them feels right in saying anything, so they talk about everything else. A short chapter, a fairly light chapter. I think its main purpose is to unite us all in hatred of Miss Bingley. I think it works. I don't think we were much in doubt on the subject anyway, but keep in mind, in the course of this novel, a tiny sliver of doubt as to whether or not Miss Bingley is a horrible viper has been maintained. She can sometimes be surface charming. Not now, not in Pemberley itself, but she could sometimes be surface charming. And Jane, our paragon, our saint, who's right now taking care of her brood of the gardener's children, keep in mind, probably having a ball doing it, Jane refused at first to see anything mean-spirited or evil in her. But after this chapter, we're in no doubt. You don't say those things about Lizzie without fighting words. A quiet chapter, but don't get used to it. Believe you me, there are velociraptors coming. But anyway, we're going to wrap this up for now, but we'll be back next time. Thank you, BookTube.